Baby bubble gum. It's going done.
Cheese. I was thinking a little over the last few weeks, and I don't know what, somebody mentioned something and it made me think about all of the things that were a part of my sort of everyday life that when I was a kid that my kids won't experience. And let me give you a few examples, right? When I was a kid, we wanted to go to a movie. You know what we did? We looked at this thing called a newspaper, and it had all of it had the section, right? The movie section. We had all the movie theaters. I grew up in a big area, so there's a lot of movie theaters around. So it had all the movie theaters and all the movies listed. And you had to go through the little show times, and that's how you figured out what time to go to the movie. And you used to get really mad when your sister threw away the newspaper or something like that, and you wanted to go see a movie and you couldn't find it. You had to go to Neighbors or something like that. And then they upgraded, the movie theaters upgraded. Remember, you could call a movie theater, right? And you'd have to listen to every single movie because you always want to see the last, the alphabetized. So you have to listen to all of them. Rocky playing at 10:45, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and then you go through the whole thing, right? And then they really got fancy, and when we went from the thing called a rotary phone to a push tone, you could call up and then you could press 1 for this movie or 2, for then you could listen to Showtime, right? That's how if we want to go to a movie when I was a kid, that's our young adult, that's how we did. Well, now when I want to go to a movie, I pick up my phone and I click on it and I go to the little Flickster app, right? And it'll give me all the movies, theaters around, and I can search by movie theater, by time it's showing, by the movie, and it can even tell me where to eat. Right? It'll even say, here's some restaurants by the movie theater that you would probably like. And so it makes it really easy. Dating is a whole lot easier now with my wife, because I can just hey, when we want to say, oh, let's go try this restaurant. And if you rank your restaurants in there, it'll even start making recommendations based on what other people like. Like if you didn't like a restaurant, it'll say, oh, then don't go to this one, because people that didn't like that one didn't go to this one. And so that's how we go to movies. And my son can do that, right? My 9-year-old can do that. Emma's pretty close to figuring it out on how to find movies. And they'll never have to look in the newspaper again, right, to find a movie theater. I was also thinking about, because we're getting ready for the New York, we're going to spend a few days in New York with the family, and Nate and I got on the phone, and we get the whole trip mapped out, right? And I was thinking about, I can remember taking vacations with the family, and we had those big folding paper maps, right? And I grew up in Texas, so the Texas map is like 14 feet wide and about 12 feet tall, and you're in a car, and you're trying to do it, and Mom was, I can hear the argument, because Mom was navigating know where we are on the map, right? Because you have to try to find it on the map. And then once you unfolded it, you might as well just crumple it up in a big ball and uncrumple it because you're never going to fold it back, and it's just easier, right? My dad had like a plan to refold the map. He even drew little numbers on it. Still didn't work. Okay, that's just where my dad was. And I was thinking about that because, again, I haven't used a paper map in years. It's been, I cannot do it on my phone or my GPS. I just punch in and I get this pretty little girl's voice. I'm assuming she's a pretty little girl because she sounds pretty on the GPS. And she'll just tell me where to go, right? Turn left in 100 feet. Right? Veer to the right. Do whatever. And as long as I listen to her, which is sort of hard for a man to listen to a woman giving you directions, but I try. And she'll get me where I need to go. And my kids are never going to experience the map thing. Probably won't. I mean, the most they'll ever do is print something out from Google Maps, right? That may be the most that they do, but even that's even like old for my son. He doesn't even want to do that anymore. And so I was thinking about, there's a lot of things that just part of life is that the world around you changes, doesn't it? And there are things that some of you who have more experience than I do, you can remember when things that were commonplace were part of your everyday life, we don't even think about. Like I've never experienced, and the generation behind me has never experienced. And we live in a world that ever since mankind has been in this world, okay, from the very beginning, that it's been a world of change. There are things that we do today that we never would have thought of. Again, we were Bradley was over at the house and the neighbors playing a game on my phone. I go, Bradley, did you ever imagine someone would sit there and be able to play these really cool games on a something you can fit in the palm of your hand? He's like, we didn't even think about games, right? I can remember when Palm came out. That was a really cool video game, right? Doom, dong, dong. That was so obnoxious, but that's the only thing that we had. And this is this sort of changing world that we live in, and because of that, sometimes it's easy to lose sight of what doesn't change, right? In this world, you're never going to stop change, right? I've got some sort of distant family who they live off the grid, right? Anybody got a crazy cousin like that? I do. And he lives off the grid, right? He lives in the woods, and he kills his own food, and he doesn't have electricity, and it's like he's in, from the late 1800s is where he's still living, and that's the way. But even then, the world around him, whether he wants to or not, whether we want to or not, the world around us is going to change. But there are some things that never, ever change. That haven't changed from the time man began to the time God created us until now. And I think as we continue our study in the book of 1 Timothy, if you have your Bibles, let me encourage you to turn there. Sometimes I think we tend to fall in the trap of thinking that we're the first generation or the first group of people to experience this crazy change. But 2,000 years ago, when Paul was writing this letter to Timothy, showing Timothy how to be the man that God created him to be, showing Timothy how he can have the ministry that God created him to be, and I think by extension showing us how we can be the men and women and have the ministry that God created for us. It's easy to forget that the world was changing quickly for Paul and the other Jewish men and women. In Paul's day, what had happened is that in a short period of time, they had gone from the Jewish people believing that they were the center of all spirituality. And that's what they believed. They believed that they had the connection to God that no one else had. And in a way, it's true, right? I mean, the temple was in Jerusalem. That's where the presence of God lived and stayed. That's where if you wanted to perform a sacrifice to God for forgiveness of your sins, you went to the temple in Jerusalem. And it went from that to suddenly Jesus coming and saying, hey, I'm the perfect sacrifice. So guess what? You don't need the temple anymore. And saying to them that, hey, it's good that you have this, the law, the Old Testament, but that's not really enough. Jesus says, I'm enough. And then a lot of the Jewish people begin to follow this crazy guy, this crazy teacher named Jesus who died and came back 3 days later and went to heaven a month and a half after that. And they begin to follow him. And then something else crazy happened that I don't think many of them expected, was that God opened up the faith, opened up to be followers of Christ to the Gentiles. And that was just, to many of the Jewish people, was beyond their understanding. They could not even grasp how God would let these Gentiles be equal with the Jewish people. And if you look, especially in the book of Acts, a lot of the arguments and discussions and problems in the early church were problems because Jewish people were struggling with the fact that the Gentiles were on equal footing before God with them. That they didn't have to become Jewish in order to become Christian. That they could just become followers of Christ right where they are, right what they were doing, and just continue to I tried to think about how to compare that, but can you imagine if within 20 years the more Christians were in the Middle East, in Muslim, what are now Muslim countries, and are in the West? And that's what was happening. It went from Christianity being a faith for the Jewish people, where most of them were Jewish, to within about 20 to 30 years, most of the Christians were Gentiles, who didn't really care about all the Old Testament. They cared about the theology and who God was, but they ate bacon, and they liked it. And they didn't care that the Jewish people didn't like it. They ate it, and they would get all the foods that they would need, and they would do all kinds of things that good Jewish people would never consider doing. And it was just creating this upheaval and this, look at how fast everything's changing, and why can't we slow down, and why can't we just go back to the way things were before? And so in the midst of all of that going on, Paul, when he's writing to Timothy, he takes a moment and sort of almost like a pause in the middle of this letter to Timothy. He reminds Timothy, hey, there may be a lot of changes. There may be a lot going on. But let me remind you of what never changes. So that's what we're going to look at today. And we're going to read quite a few verses and go through a lot of stuff. But I got to go sort of the long way around to get back to where we need to be, because this passage is just full of some really awesome things that it reminds us about at the end of the day, as Christians, what never changes. What do we make sure we hold on to and don't compromise on? You know, there are things that you and I can discuss and debate, and you can disagree with me on these things that we're going to talk about today, and that's fine. You have the legal right to do it. But I'm not going to even argue with you about it, because there's no point. Because if you don't believe this, then I'm going to say something really that could be a little hard. But if you don't believe what Paul is writing today, then he would say you're not really even a believer. You may come to church, you may call yourself a Christian, but unless you believe these things, because these, what it all boils down to, are the unchangeables that we all believe. So let's look at 1 Timothy chapter 3. I'm going to begin reading in verse 14. Here's what Paul says. I hope to come to you soon, but I am writing these things so that if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth. All right, let's stop there. So here's what Paul's saying. He's saying, look, I want to come back to Ephesus. Remember, Ephesus was the church in the town that Paul spent more time in than any of the other places that he did on his missionary journeys. On average, when Paul went into a town and started a church, he spent 6 to 9 months on average. He spent a total of 3.5 years in Ephesus. He loved this place. This was a church and a group of people that were dear to his heart. And he's writing this and saying, look, I want to come back to you, but if I'm delayed, because one thing Paul knew about his life is that it was not predictable.